Well, thank you everyone for joining today to this session where we want to do more with less and create impact. This session relates to one of the initiatives that we are working on in shifting the funding paradigm at Catalyst Now, where we have Nadait here and Michael, which are one of our co-chairs for the working group and are one of our most active members within the shifting funding paradigm space. And they have been working on a very interesting tool, which is a funding calculator. And perhaps I will let Nadait give a brief interview and then I can explain more about the shifting funding paradigm working group. Does that work, Nadait, or would you like me to? Yeah? Okay, perfect. So, well, in our working group, Nadait will lead the discussion today. Please introduce yourselves in the chat and where you are calling from, and let us know why you joined this session, what made you interest to join the session today. If you have any questions, also put in the chat and I'll make sure to reply. And yeah, I think that's it from me, Nadait. I'll compliment you if anything comes up. But
thanks, Ines. All right, next slide, please. Amazing. Thank you. So the penny costs more than worse. This is an interesting fact, one of the interesting facts that I learned when I moved to the United States. It costs about 4 cents to make a penny. So essentially, the US government is spending a lot more when they're minting pennies. So why is it in circulation? The answer isn't simple. There are a few different things at play: history, tradition, legislative inertia. There are beneficiaries of the current system. There are complexities associated with change. So removing the penny involves logistical challenges, and it's a whole host of factors, essentially. So what this problem, the penny problem, demonstrates is that even when something is inefficient, wasteful, downright illogical, a mix of vested interests or social norms, or the sheer difficulty of changing established systems can keep that status quo in place, essentially perfectly intact. So I would like us to consider this issue as we get into today's session about how the social sector distributes resources. Next slide, please. Before we dive in, these are our housekeeping rules. So adjust your Zoom name to your full name and also company. Everybody will be muted. That will be the baseline. And if you would like to contribute, either raise your hands or you can also speak. And then for the camera, if you can turn it on, that would be amazing. If not, that's also all right. And then if you have any questions, feel free to jump in. Next slide, please. All right. So I'm going to start by welcoming everybody for joining us today on a Monday morning. Well, it's noon here, so Monday noon. And I want to give you some context before getting into the details of the discussion, why I became interested in the topic that we're going to be discussing today, which is cost efficiency in how we allocate resources within the social sector, why it's important and why I care about it, essentially. My interest in the issue comes from my experience as the co-founder of a nonprofit organization, a social enterprise that is addressing the digital divide called Hagush. Early on in our journey, when we ventured into the world of fundraising, we quickly realized that many aspects of how the social sector funding paradigm works are not ideal. And one area that stood out in particular was these competition-based funding allocation processes, like grants or challenges or prizes that required multiple applicant organizations to submit proposals in competition with one another. And we quickly realized that these processes can be complex, they can be time consuming, they can be extremely resource intensive. And then at one point, we applied to one particular funding opportunity where a funder was allocating about $3 million US annually to early stage organizations, social impact organizations, and that would go 100,000 each to 30 organizations. And competing for the application for us took many, many hours of our team's time. And the funding call, this particular funding call, happens every year. It's very popular. And we learned at one point that approximately 2,000 organizations applied to this funding opportunity. So that was the seed that got this line of work started within the Shifting Funding Paradigm Working Group. If our organization was spending so much time for this one particular funding opportunity, every other organization within the 2,000 applicants that were applying were spending about the same, with some variability, of course. So this led to a question: how much are we collectively spending in the social sector just to participate in these funding processes and to get access to a pool of funding? And how does it compare? Is anyone tracking it? Is anyone at all tracking the cost? And also, how does it compare to the amount that eventually gets awarded to organizations? So before we dive into the details, I want to take a moment here to thank folks who are from the Shifting Funding Paradigm Working Group, which is a working group within Catalyst 2030 that is working on this particular issue, but also on many other issues that are related to shifting the funding paradigm, as the name indicates. There's Michael, Inez, let me see quickly in the chat, who else? Jacob, hi, Matthew. Okay, so a number of people. So I just want to take a moment and say thank you. And then also give you an idea of what we'll be diving into going forward. So in the beginning, I'll talk about the issue and what we have discovered. Then I will there will be a part of the session where it will be interactive sharing, where we'll hear from the audience. Everybody participate, share your thoughts on the issue, any frustrations with the current funding paradigm. And then I'll pass it on to Michael, where in that part of the session, we'll hear a bit about the funding footprint calculator. And then we will go back to the details of the problem and how we've decided to start addressing it. And then in the end, we'll wrap up with key takeaways, and then that will be a wrap. So now on to the issue. 4.2 trillion, that is the annual funding shortfall to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, ostensibly over the next 5 years, but at this point, that ship might have sailed unless we actively revert course. And if there's one thing within the social sector that we seem to be in violent agreement on, it is that the funding landscape is in dire straits, especially in the context of the recent cuts in international development aid. We are at a moment where expanding the pool of resources for social impact is top of mind for many of us. The discourse around the issue of expanding the pool of resources has often focused on how and where to raise more funds to fill the gaps that are being created by shrinking public sector funding. What we rarely hear is whether and how we can optimize our existing processes to get more out of what we already have. Because the fact of the matter is, expanding resources isn't just about increasing funding, it is also about designing smarter, more cost-efficient processes that reduce waste and ensure every dollar delivers maximum impact. Next slide, please. Thank you. So just to drive that point home, I want to take a moment here and share one of my favorite concepts from the systems thinker, Dana Meadows, from her book, Thinking in Systems. Let's imagine the box in the middle where it says resource for impact. That is the pool of resources that we have for social impact. And then on the left side is the inflow of resources, whether that's the funding that is coming from the private sector, could be from the public sector, could be from foundations, wherever it is, there is a pool of funding that is coming, and that is the inflow of resources that we have to the pool. Then we have the outflow of resources. One outflow is how we're spending the resources in designing and scaling solutions, innovations, and things like that. And then one thing that we forget to think about is there is another outflow that goes into essentially making social impact happen. So the process, essentially. So one example is the funding allocation process itself. That's the process, and we need to pay for it. And this process has a cost, a non-zero cost, and that cost comes from that same pool of resources that we have for social impact. So this is a perfect visual illustration, basically, of that underscores the idea that if we want to increase the pool of resources that we have for social impact, one way we could do it is increasing the inflow of resources. So raising more, whether it's from public funding or other places. And then the other way we can increase the resource of the resources that we have for social impact is to make sure that we have efficient systems and that lead to less waste, less inefficiency, and make sure that we're not draining resources. So next slide, please. It's important to note that here, an important question that we often get is whether the goal is efficiency or is it impact. Sometimes we can have inefficient systems if they're achieving some goal that we have, some desired goal. For instance, that could be optimal resource allocation, or it could be greater accountability of systems or more transparency. So if our processes are achieving these things and the inefficiency is actually intentional to make the systems better, then is that a problem? And technically, that's not a problem because we are intentionally making processes inefficient for the intended purpose of making getting funding, for instance, to the right people. While that's well and good, one thing to keep in mind is it is important to recognize that the trade-offs we're making, these trade-offs, having a more optimal resource allocation system that is inefficient, that allows us to fund the right solutions, is coming at a cost of less funding that could go directly to scaling impact, or that could go to innovation and things like that. So the important thing to do is to recognize that there are trade-offs that we're making and to explicitly state what these trade-offs are. And the reason why it's important to do that is then we can go back and see if this trade-off worth it, or should we change our processes to make them more efficient. Next slide, please. So now I will open the floor to hear from folks, reflections, discussions about the experiences that you've had within the social sector, about the funding processes, not just related to this particular process of grant applications. It could be anything, but any frustrations and how you've addressed it. If you're an organization working within the social sector, if you've had to collaborate as a way to optimize on resources that we already have, then we would love to hear from you. I will start with Michael, but before that, I just want to say when folks are sharing what their experiences have been so far, it would be great if you can introduce yourself and also give us some context about where you're joining from and what you hope to get from this discussion. So I'll pass it on to Michael now.
Thanks, Nadait. So I'm Michael Gilligan. I'm the co-chair with Nadait of the Shifting the Funding Paradigm Working Group. And I must admit that the funding footprint calculator is her brainchild and a focus of her co-chair work. I am here as a thought partner and as to support the work. But my efforts within the working group are focused on, in this new reality of our not only not meeting the funding gap, but our sector actually seems to be shrinking in response to the greater demands of our society, how we can restructure our social impact organizations in order to access greater funding opportunities. So that's my work. Now I'll turn to the question at hand that Nadait posed. Within the current paradigm, we've all experienced, and I've experienced it for years as both a grant maker and a grantee, the inefficiencies of the process, and I'd go further to say that inequities of the process, that without the co-creation of solutions, the power paradigm rests with funders. And I know that the majority of us on the call are from the grant seeking community, but collectively we have power to shift how funders operate, as well as how we conduct our own processes to seek funds. And one of the things that I think is the focus of this Catalyst Change Week is collaboration. So a frustration is like the competitive grant making process is so, it's inefficient, it's inequitable, and we don't see opportunities for collaboration. So how can we create them? I think that by basing our demands to the funding community, that we want to work with our peers, that we want to have opportunities to share processes and procedures and ideas with fellow collaborators, that we can start to shift the process. And I think that the funding footprint calculator does a very effective job of case making to the funding community that we're losing a tremendous amount of resources just in executing the process. There's just drag on the funding process through the current structure, and that we would be able to allocate more to programmatic support by changing processes. But what the solutions are, they're to be determined, because I think the very idea of co-creation, co-development of these processes is just new to all of us. So it's a work in motion. It's a work in progress. And before I just go on and on because I can talk forever. I'm going to turn it back to Nadait to open the discussion with all of you.
Thanks, Michael. Obviously, everything you said resonates, and I cannot agree more with the need for better systems that allow for more collaborative approaches to problem solving. So 100% with you there. I'm gonna quickly see, I can't see everybody on my screen, but if folks have raised, okay, Jacob, yes, I can see. We'll go to you next.
Yeah, hey, and very glad to be here with everybody, especially with this topic. So I'm Jacob Dietz calling from Texas, and currently one of the organizations I support is the Global Mental Health Task Force, and sort of start here, then probably return back to it. But one of the ways that we're trying to set ourselves up is as a backbone organization. You know, there's so many organizations that are out there that are doing the work, that are also drowning in a lot of things like fundraising, marketing, you know, measurement and evaluation. And so, you know, how can you have organizations be able to take some of that load off the shoulders of leaders to allow them to do the work that they need to do? And so for me, I think, you know, one of the, you know, I've been in this space for about 4 years now, and quickly was frustrated with like how rigid the process was. And, you know, I've thought a lot about how, you know, we are approaching specifically with like grant funding and a lot of fundraising. It's, you know, you spend all this time up front planning, doing a lot of work to apply for a grant that you may or may not get. And even if you get it, who knows, it could be 6 months to a year by the time that that money returns to the organization. And I think that that doesn't match the dynamic nature of the work we're doing and the world that we live in. And I think I've thought a lot about, you know, different ways to solve that, thinking of like, I call it like the dreaming phase funding, where you're bringing everyone to the table, you're bringing funders, you're bringing the organizations, you're bringing community members to work and design this project or program together, but money's at the table. You can have sort of half up front and half upon implementation of the work. And I think that, you know, Michael brought up a really great point about the value that organizations bring. And, you know, early in my work, learned about just the value of blended finance and approaching it, you know, being able to define what value are you bringing. Do you have a collaboration with someone in the private sector that's bringing a resource that might not be money but has value? You know, thinking about the networks, thinking about the relationships, but you know, that power imbalance that's currently present. Sometimes you think, you know, money is what, you know, has the most value and the most power, but without all of these other systems and relationships in place, as you can see, you know, that it's not a great investment. And to me, going back to sort of like a backbone organization, what I love about what we're trying to do at the task force is sort of create like a kind of like a playground for collaboration, where organizations can, within the task force, are able to build and design collaborative programs together, that we can, as a task force, thus support through our network, through with trying to get funding, trying to, you know, convene, bring other organizations into the mix, but really push for that collaborative work. You know, thinking about just like the classic definition of collective impact. You know, that's been something that's really been important to me in terms of approaching funding differently. Is, you know, how can we come together? And so as an organization, we are providing that space where we are bringing people together, where they can work and build and build relationships first. And so that work is starting from a foundation of trust. But yeah, I think that there's a lot of creative ways, but it starts with bringing all of the voices together.
Thank you. Thank you, Jacob, for that. I want to touch on the part where he talked about the power imbalance. That I want to tie that to what Michael said about how collectively we have more power. So long as we are able to find a narrative around which we can organize, essentially, and make a compelling case for change, because of the fact that there's so many organizations and there's power in the collective, we can, I feel in many ways that that is a very much untapped resource, because again, organizing takes a lot of effort, building coalitions takes a lot of effort and funding. And so that is obviously a barrier, but if we're able to accomplish that, then there's potential to change the current existing system. One of the questions when I did this presentation during UNGA week that I got was everybody who, so the target audience for this tool that we're going to be talking about in a bit is funders, generally. But most of the people who showed up to that session were organizations, grantee organizations. And so we talked about the session, talked about this tool that we built, and we'll get into the details of that. But one of the folks raised an important question, because I kept saying we need to change the way we do things and things like that. And then they raised their hand and said, who's we? Who's the we here that you keep talking about? And then in the moment I said, we is, society, humanity, like people. I should have said later on, it occurred to me, I should have said, it's going to be, whether it's funders, her point was funders were not here, and funders are the ones that have the power to do anything about this problem. And so in the end, later on when I thought about it, it is a difficult problem to solve, but all of the funding related problems, anything that requires shifting power, it's a difficult problem, a complex problem to solve. And the we is always going to be a small group of determined individuals, then that, build the coalitions or build the movement that requires to achieve change through collective organizing. Anyone else has thoughts? Selena.
Hey, yeah, thank you so much, Nadait, and everyone else that spoke. This really brings a lot of clarity for me. So I'm based in Canada, in Toronto, and I'm part of a social purpose enterprise who advocates for language access and change at a systemic level. And I myself am only recently learning about budgeting. It's wasn't ever really top of my mind, and I guess I kind of fumbled in here through that advocacy route. So learning about these different types of tools is really great. And that example that you gave of the 2,000 organizations competing for those grants really illustrates like that systemic waste you were talking about in funding. So one trade-off that I've kind of been able to see, also I'm gesticulating so much, but you can't see me because my video needs to be off because of my bandwidth. But one trade-off that I see in my role, at least, is it's between equity and efficiency, I guess. And I want to learn how to bridge that gap, because a lot of our funding processes right now, it seems as if they prioritize like that competition and that compliance. And then with that, it comes with a lot of hidden costs, especially for organizations like us, or in major cities like this, where they're serving multilingual or marginalized communities. So translation, interpretation, and those kinds of requirements they drain a lot of resources that I guess are not being put into account. And like, so for example, recently I attended a meeting, a budget meeting with the city of Toronto, and they have no specific language or funding framework for language access. So for example, I looked into the police is being allocated maybe like up towards like billions of dollars, I think this year. And their only priority that was itemized was getting more ASL interpreters for deaf and hard of hearing individuals, which is, you know, a major gap because there, especially in Toronto, there are so many multilingual or minority speaking groups that are a majority of our population. So what my organization has done, I guess, to mitigate this is that we have a funding model that ensures this kind of transparency and fairness through like a first come first serve policy, and it helps to cover free and subsidized interpretation, but this fund is only a surplus from the business revenue of my NGO. So if there's no surplus, then we can't fund those organizations, and we've spent, I think, over the last 6 years maybe like $1 million perhaps in support for these services, but it's, of course, it's never enough. So I guess my question is like, how do we advocate for those considerations so that efficiency doesn't come at the expense of inclusion and equity?
That's a really great point. Thank you so much for sharing. So my perspective on this is the starting point is to recognize the trade-off and see how, try to get a sense of how much that trade-off is costing, and then compare it to the gain. Obviously, equity is an important desired outcome of the processes that we want to build. It's part of the equation of building that outcome that we want for the world that we want. And so the starting point so far where we are at with this work is highlighting that there is a cost to the processes, make that visible, and B, when there are trade-offs that we are making, make them explicit. That way it is easier to assess if the trade-offs are worth making, essentially. Because right now we're not there at all. But it's definitely one of those key tension points where there is a specific outcome you want, and that requires you to make a system inefficient, and that's completely fine. But the key thing that needs to happen is recognize there is a trade-off and try to quantify the trade-off, and if it's worth it, if it is an important goal for you, then you keep the trade-off, essentially. I don't know if folks have thoughts on this particular issue, because it's kind of hard, I feel, to define in terms of cost when something like equity or accountability or transparency are the values that you're gaining from the process. I haven't been monitoring the chat, so if there are questions in the chat, please feel free to jump in. Otherwise, we can continue the presentation. Yes, thank you. Thank you, everyone, for participating. We will go to the next slide. All right, so I mentioned this idea of optimizing the process of funding within the social sector, and optimizing the pool of resources that we have came from this experience that my organization had pretty early on applying for funding in the beginning. That experience led to that question of what is the collective cost like across the 2,000 applicants. And so from there, when we started engaging with the question at the Shifting Funding Paradigm Working Group, the first thing that we tried to do is look for data in terms of answering, is the collective cost a lot? Are we in the social sector essentially operating at a net loss, or are we operating at a net positive? We had no idea. So we wanted to look into that essentially. And so the first place to start was look for data. We did that. We couldn't get access to data that stated the number of applicants that funders were getting, how many of those applications were getting funded, and then how much funding was getting mobilized through this process. And so then we decided we will just do a thought experiment with this particular case that we have of this one funder, and that's what we did. With the thought experiment, we started with the assumption that it costs about 15 cents to the dollar raised to access the pool of funding. So that number, we got it from proprietary data that was collected on nonprofit organizations for the funding, for fundraising in general. So not specifically grant related funding, but but generally fundraising. And the finding was it costs 15 cents to 50 cents to the dollar raised for organizations to do their fundraising processes. And so we took the lower margin, 15 cents to the dollar raised, and then we computed for 2,000 applicants, what is that cost like? And we found for the 3 million to get out the door from the funder side, potentially organizations were spending 30 million to access that pool of funding collectively. So from that thought experiment, we concluded 3 things. One is that it is entirely possible that within the social sector that we may be operating in a net loss, essentially, to engage in this process. And then the second conclusion was it's also possible that the social sector may be operating on a net positive, maybe marginally or by a significant margin. But the very fact that we didn't have the data to be able to categorically conclude that we're definitely not operating at a net loss, that in itself was, we thought, is a problem. So those were the conclusions that we reached. After that, for us, one of the very remarkable things about this particular issue that we started to think about was how normalized it has become to engage in this staggeringly inefficient process within the social sector, but also across the economy. You see it everywhere. Grant making is not particularly, it's not a thing that is specific to the social sector. That's how researchers get access to grants to do research in academia. There's all kinds of fellowships and awards and challenges that require organizations or individuals to compete for a pool of funding. And so that in itself, the fact that this issue was completely, it felt in many ways invisible. And so we decided to come up with this tool to help make the problem more visible and allow, whether it's funders, but also really anyone, the ability to estimate the cost, the hidden costs of this particular process. And then the other reason for why we designed this tool, which I will share in a moment, is the very fact that there was no data that we could access. We thought this tool could be a way we can encourage funders to keep track of certain variables that are important for estimating the cost of the funding process on the side of applicants. So I will share my slide in a minute, my screen in a minute, to show you how the tool works. Doesn't seem to be networking. That's not great. Why is there no network? You can all hear me, right? So for some reason, I don't seem to have, but I can share it in the chat for everybody. Okay. Okay. Sure. Okay, so I am able to open it now, so I can share my screen. I apologize for the noise in the background. I hope it's not too loud. Okay. There. Okay. I imagine you can all see the slides now. I mean okay, amazing. So the way it works is, so it's called funding footprint calculator, and the way it works is the first thing is select which what kind of funder you are. So if you're a family foundation, you say you're a family foundation, or if you're anything else, you state that. And then the funding amount is the next thing you input. The funding amount in this particular case, I will go with 3 million for that organization. Am I audible, by the way, just quickly? Because suddenly it came really loud on my end. So 3 million with that one particular organization. Then the total number of applicants. In this particular case, it was 2,000. So we'll go with 2,000. And then the next thing is, how would you like to estimate the cost per application? There are multiple ways you can do this. What we recommend is, the exact cost per application. So if you're a funder, it's ideal if you know this. The problem is that it's very common for funders not to know this number. And in that case, you have the option to go with, I know the time spent on the application, and then the hourly cost for the labor. And so you can click that and input those values. But it is also common for funders not to know the time that applicants spent on their funding processes. And so the last option is, you don't know these details, but you know the number of successful applicants. So you can go with that, because typically you know that variable. We recommend the first two options. The first option really, the second option is just the first option. Said another way, if you don't want to do any math. The last option is, it works for non-outlier cases where you have an idea of what how much the cost can be. And the reason for this is because of how it's using to derive the value. Essentially, it's using one number, which is 15 cents to the dollar raised. It's assuming that specific value, which may vary from organization to organization. So it doesn't do well with outlier cases. So we will go for this particular case. It was 30 applicants that won the funding for 3 million. And then you click compute, and then it generates a value for you. So this was, I know the exact. Okay. Let's see. I'm gonna go back and make sure, oh no. Make sure it's working properly. It might be glitching. Funding amount, 3 million. Okay, and then total number of applicants was 2,000. And then I know. Okay. Okay. So this will be the output that it gives you for that particular case. It gives two outputs. One is the funding footprint, and then the other is the burn index. The funding footprint is it just calculates it across the applicants, how much resources are they spending. So it's pretty straightforward. And then the second thing, the burn index, is that funding footprint divided by the total amount that the funder gives out. And that gives you an idea of, it essentially compares how much the cost on the side of applicants is compared to the amount that was given. And if it says 10, as it does in this case, it's saying it's 10 times the amount that was given to grantee organizations. So the amount that was spent on the side of applicants is 10 times the amount that was allocated in funding. So the 30 million is 10 times 3 million essentially. So that's how the tool works. I will quickly stop sharing and then continue with the slides, and then we can have a discussion. Okay, I think it's quieter now, which is great. Okay. Where's the screen? I lost the screen for a minute, sorry. I can't see anybody now, or anything really. What's happening? Oh yeah.
You're back to the slide deck.
Yes, yeah, that's what I'm trying to, the Zoom disappeared. Now I can see everybody. Now the slide deck I can see. All right, so next slide, please. Okay, I've already touched on this. Next slide, please. So now that I've talked about how the two metrics are the key things that essentially lets you know if you're spending a lot more on the process itself than you're putting out into the world as a funder. Next slide, please. Next, please. Thank you. So from all of this, after we built the tool, the next step was to think about what do we do about this particular issue? And like Michael said, there isn't one solution that will make this problem go away. Obviously, it's a complex issue, but one thing that could obviously be done is to streamline the funding process as we know it. And for that, we can think about streamlining the application process itself. That could mean using a common application, for instance, or making the questions that get asked less complex, or have instead of, some applications would have things like, oh, this has to be 200 characters, and then organizations are doing this thing constantly where they have the responses, but they have to keep repackaging everything into, more words, less words, now this, now that, essentially. And then you can also, as a funder, take steps to ensure only qualified candidates apply. You can have pre-screening questions, or before the actual application process, you can have technology that makes sure whether or not folks meet the basic criteria, if you have criteria, and then make the criteria as easily accessible as possible. That way, people who qualify and organizations that qualify are the ones applying. And the last thing is to continuously track and analyze the data. One of the things, like I said, the problem with this issue is that no one is tracking the cost, what it's like on the side of applicants. So for funders, if they could track what is the cost, what is the time that it takes for grantees to apply for their given funding opportunity, that would be great. And once they know, they can then analyze, refine the process to create a more resource efficient funding application process, essentially. So now I think we can go to the discussion session and hear people's thoughts.
Like we have a question in the chat
Okay, amazing. Let me see.
from Amina, which asks, how can we use this information in the calculator to convince the most, I would say, the skeptical funders to change their application processes? What do you think would be the biggest barriers?
Okay, so I will say one potential thing that applicant organizations can do is, if you know, at least, if you know another organization that is applying to the same opportunity, you can band together, essentially. You can use this tool, and the tool, you can take it to funders and say, this is what's happening on our side. Are you aware? And generally they won't be aware, and take it from there. That is a case by case application. I think ultimately what needs to happen is there needs to be a standard set about what is the kind of application that is resource efficient. So if there is a standard, if people have an idea of it's not a good thing to spend, well, not a good thing. It's not the standard within the social sector is to strive to make your process more resource efficient. If you can cement that as a way to behave, then there could be like mass movement towards that on the side of funders. But on a case-by-case basis, you can use the tool as a way to advocate for yourself, essentially, and band together and go to funders. Those are, okay, and then we have Stefan.
Yes, so I can verbalize my question.
Yes.
So thank you very much. I must say I'm very grateful. This is my first opportunity to have a sit in such a space where we are deliberating on real issues. I compare your introductory part and the subsection of granting, and I think this is just so good. Traditionally, organizations, funders have different the way they call out for their proposals, but I think the funding footprint calculator is not only talking about efficiency, but it's looking at it from I would say a new equity approach where we want to address issues to do with a competition within organization at both funding level and the implementation. And then by default at the community level where we talk of the beneficiaries. And then also duplication. Yes, many funders, for lack of a better word, call the same activity with different names. And then now it looks like they are funding something else. For example, if you're doing smart farming, yes, smart farming simply means using technology to implement agriculture. Yeah, but someone will call it a different name, and therefore, before you realize, it is purely duplication. The other thing that I also want to mention based on what you just talked about is the collaboration. Yeah, I think many a times the implementing partners look at collaboration as a loss of control. While from what you're sharing with us, I completely feel that this is a shared stewardship for collective impact. So I think those are the areas that we can have a look at. And I don't know how this is possible. We could quickly pick USAID funding crisis that happened recently. and use that to anchor this very beautiful discussion, so that it is the real crisis that we have at hand. And I'm just thinking, if this was introduced before, there is one big thing called system vulnerability. And like I've said, in system vulnerability, most organizations that win big fundings seem to be having very well structured systems. But look at today with the budget cuts and from the USAID, the biggest organizations are the most hit because now they can't survive without the traditional USAID funding. Yes, so something to very, very good. I am happy. I'm actually learning a lot, and I'm looking forward to be part of this group. Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Stefan. That you've raised terribly important points that have to do with the calculator, but also more generally with the funding paradigm. There's definitely a lot that needs to be done. I'm seeing the time and we have only 2 minutes. So I just want to take a minute to thank everybody and then pass it on to Michael so he can share the next steps and the key points that were raised, and then wrap us up. Over to you, Michael.
Thanks, Nadait, and a very illuminating discussion even for me, who has followed your work. So I'll try to be brief and just mention some of the key points that I heard beginning with Nadait's opening, is that seeking resources is itself resource intensive and by no means efficient or effective. And the $4.2 trillion shortfall to meet the SDGs, as a sector, we seem to be shrinking while we actually need to be expanding funding. But of course, adding resources is necessary, but also becoming more efficient needs to be part of the equation. Jacob's mention of the Global Mental Health Task Force is the drag on programs by the rigidity of the funding process. So he's instituted a dreaming phase funding process, which is iterative and shared process to convene and collaborate with the partners. I think that shows promise. And that the discussion of our collective power is necessary, because that will demonstrate to the broader community that collaboration and coalition building is a solution. So I am mindful of the time as well, and I know that we're at our limit. So I have additional thoughts that I can send to you, but what I would just say to all of you, thank you for your participation. Thank you for your thought partnership. I encourage you to join the Shifting the Funding Paradigm Working Group. It's an open group to join, and we have fascinating discussions once a month, and we have presentations from the membership, and we'll be starting a new fellowship program in the coming months, so that people can work and collaborate together on really shifting this issue. So I think I'll turn it over to Inez, that we have some closing slide to share. But again, on behalf of Nadait and myself and the whole Shifting Funding Paradigm Working Group, thanks for joining. We found it illuminating and beneficial.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Nadait, for making Catalyst and the co-creation collaboration mean so much. And as Michael said, you are free to reach out to us if you'd like to be more active. Thank you for joining. I know there's people that are either is very late for you already in the day, or you are joining the other American time sessions. So thank you so much. We will follow up. Julie, if you have the feedback form link, we would love to hear your feedback about CCW, but I'm sure you'll see the feedback form in other sessions. So, but thank you so much. Thank you, Maura. Thank you, Jacob. Thank you, everyone, for being here and being so collaborative. And please do sign up for any other sessions. We have other shifting funding paradigm sessions happening throughout the week. So if you'd like to know more about it, reach out to me. I'm always here. Thank you, everyone.